podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, ODSC, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the Software Architecture Conference, the Strata Data Conference, and PyCon US. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Matthias Aguirre about Python social auth and the complexities of third-party authentication. So Matthias, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hi everybody, my name is Matthias Aguirre. I'm a software developer from a small country in South America called Uruguay. I'm the author and maintainer of Python Social Auth.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, well, it's been a long time since that. So I got my hands on Python back in the days when Django 0.96 was a thing. It was quite a popular version back then. So with a friend, we were looking for something to move away from PHP. So we split our research, one focusing on Ruby on Rails, another focusing on Django, which were the popular solutions at that point. I was in charge of the Ruby on Rails research, but in the end, Django won the contest. I'm quite happy about that.
And on your profile, when I was looking around doing some research for the show, I noticed that the list of languages that you primarily work in includes Ruby in addition to Python and JavaScript. And so I'm wondering how much of your focus is still spent on that language and what you have found to be some of the benefits of working in both Python and Ruby, or just your overall experience of that language.
Yeah, so I worked on Ruby for several years on my previous workplace. Ruby was the main language we used. That was for around 8 years of Ruby development. And sometimes I got the chance to use some Python. As of today, I'm working on a new place. It's fully Python for everything. Over the years, I had the chance to work on Python on personal projects mostly. Python Social Auth is one of the results of that.
And so in terms of Python Social Auth, can you just start by giving a bit of a description about what the project is and some of the motivation for starting it and the origin story of how it came to be?
Yeah. So Python Social Auth is a small library, well, not quite small by now, but it aims to simplify the developer life when they want to integrate social-based authentication and authorization on their projects. So everybody is familiar with the login using X social auth buttons around the web. Python Social Auth wants to hide the complexity behind that functionality while giving enough room to define a good solution that better fits your project. Like many projects, it got started due to frustration with the solutions that were available at that time. It was a small library that I code while working on a personal project. The solutions that were popular back then, they have complicated setups or not enough room to add my requirements. So I found as my own project, Django Social Auth back then, which fully focused on Django. And then it becomes a really popular solution. And a couple of years later, it morphed into Python Social Auth.
And at this point, it seems to have become somewhat of the de facto standard for being able to handle these third-party login integrations. I'm wondering what you think are some of the contributing factors to the popularity that it has gained, and maybe give a bit of a description of some of the overall landscape of available options, particularly now, since, as you said at the beginning, when you first started the project, there weren't really a lot to choose from.
So yeah, I'd say that the main contributing factor to make it so popular was the simplicity while integrating on Django. The idea overall of the project was that with really small set of settings or small changes in your code base, you will have a fully working authentication process using a social website as your source of information for the user details and user profile. Then the second key factor on the proprietor, I would say, is a particular feature on the library, which is called pipeline. And this feature allows you to extend the authentication process as much as you want with any requirements that are needed for your project. Back then, this functionality didn't exist on the solutions. Actually, as I recall, the popular library at that time, you were required to define templates, add buttons, add forms, and that didn't seems like the proper solution for authentication flow, where usually you just click a button, go to the provider, authentication provider, to put your credentials in there, and then you are sent back to your site, and you have your account already up and running. That was main focus on Python sellout, and it did quite well, but it does that today too.
And then in terms of some of the use cases of when somebody might want to enable integration with these third-party identity providers, what are some of the motivations there? And what are some of the trade-offs or drawbacks of delegating authentication and identity to those third parties versus controlling it entirely in your application?
Almost every web application requires users to be registered in order to properly work. It's a common pattern. Everybody wants users on their side using the application. And it's a very common problem, but it demands quite a lot of work to solve. You need to define forms or validations, email confirmation, you have profile, pictures, upload details, etc., etc. It's a very complex project and demands a lot of work. And then there's the security bit of all this, which is password, handling password, ensuring that they're properly hashed on your database. You use a salt, a good algorithm. Then there's potential of leaking this password out, and especially when there are so many bad practices used by user, like use the same password for every site. There's a risk, a security risk on all this. Social authentication solves most all of these problems. There's no forms, you just put a link on your site. Profile details are already populated from the authentication provider. Email address are usually already validated by these authentication providers. Especially there's no password on your end. You don't need to have a password stored on your database at all. So there are many factors that get reduced simply by adding a link or a button on your site.
And for a number of projects, they'll actually have both options where you can create an account using an email or a username and password, but then also have the option of using different social providers, whether that's Google or Facebook or Twitter or GitHub or what have you. And I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the either best practice or common trends among people using Python Social Auth as to whether they prefer to have that option of maintaining identity on their platform, or if they tend to prefer just relying on these social providers as the primary or only authentication mechanisms.
Frankly, I don't see a gain on our side by maintaining authentication on our project. I really dislike password. I prefer authentication mechanisms where I put my email address and a temporary password or link is emailed to my account. There's no need to password at all. So password has proved to be a really security problem since the beginning, and avoiding that as much as possible is a must for me. And for reasons why they provide both options, I fail to understand them. I tend to assume that's mostly for recovery, but there are other recovery methods today that you don't need a password on the side to access application.
Yeah, the magic link method that you're referring to as far as not having a password at all, but just taking an email account and then sending an email with a one-time use authentication token, I think is definitely gaining a lot of popularity because of the weaknesses that we've seen in passwords and passphrases that you mentioned. And so does Python Social Auth also support that type of mechanism, or is that something where you would just rely on a different library and then include that in the authentication pipeline that Python and Social Auth provides.
Yeah, so Python Cloud also provides username and password authentication. It's not commonly used, but it's there. Then you have the one-time authentication flow using an email address. That's also supported.
And can you talk a bit more about how Python Social Auth itself is actually implemented in some of the current architecture of the library and how it's evolved since the first stages of when you began working on it in the form of Django Social Auth?
Yeah. So in the beginning it was Django Social Auth. Its unique purpose was to solve the social authentication problem for just the Django projects. So in the beginning it was really highly coupled with the framework. Even some basic blocks of what's today Python already exist by then. So a key part of the implementation was ensuring that backends are the parts that will handle the communication with the authentication provider. So a key part of the implementation was defining this backend with the goal of hiding as much as possible the complexity of the authentication provider while offering clear and simple interface to the users of this provider, which is the rest of the code of Python Social Auth. Then there's models, usually like any Django project, you have models where we store the user ID of the authentication provider and the reference to the user in the database. And then there was the pipelines feature. This was really early introduced in the code base. Looking at the feature is really simple. Actually, it's a list of functions that get called on the given order. The output of the previous function is passed to the next one until the last one is executed, and the goal of the pipeline is having to have a valid user on your database that it's okay to authenticate. Those basic block of the application made it possible then to evolve it to Python Social Auth, where the Django related bits were moved to a new concept that's called a strategy. These strategies are the gluing between the framework particularities and Python Social Auth core. And that's what allowed Python Social Auth to support Django, Flask, and Pyramid, etc. You can add more integrations if you want. And those are the basic blocks today too as well. You have the authentication backends hiding the complexity of the providers, models for storage of the details, the authentication flow details, pipelines to extend your particular functionality, and the strategies to hide the framework complexities.
And what have you found to be some of the most complex or challenging aspects of designing and building this library, particularly given the number of different identity providers and the variances in the authentication protocols that they support?
So for sure, the difference in the protocol were problematic, a problem to solve by the framework. But in the end, I found that defining a really simple interface of what the application needed from this provider, that pays off very well as the code evolves, because this simple interface allows me to hide the complexity of the provider while still fulfilling the requirements for the library. For instance, there's a method called getUserDetails. I don't care. The rest of the code doesn't care about the particular implementation that this method has for the different providers. It only cares about the output result and it's having the user details available to build a user instance that is stored on the database. So ensuring that defining these interfaces, clearly define these interfaces for the rest of the code was key to hide all the complexity behind the protocols or the different application providers. Then we have differences on the protocols, like OpenID works a bit different than OAuth. They communicate different. There's XML involved, JSON API, usually JSON APIs on OAuth providers. There are these key difference between them, but it was not as much as I was expecting when adding them. It's a matter of defining the proper methods that need to be invoked on the different providers. The data is already available there to build the rest. It wasn't that complicated. In overall, the authentication flow is quite similar. You click a button on your site, you get redirected to the provider, put your credentials, and then you are sent back to your site to continue the authentication process, which usually is hidden behind in the backend.
And I know that in different implementations or different workflows, there can be cases where you have to suspend the authentication flow and then resume it either from a link sent to your email or from a different computer. And so I'm wondering how you approach that challenge of being able to ensure that the current state of the authentication for a given user is maintained across sessions or across browsers or machines.
Yeah, that functionality is provided by the partial pipelines. It's called partial pipeline. So it's something glue with the pipeline feature. It allows you to stop the authentication process at any given point. That way you can do something else, like send an email or render a form where you need extra details from the user, etc. It was a very welcome feature. In the beginning, it wasn't perfect. It was session based. So if you stop a pipeline right in the middle for some reason, you needed that confirmation from an email, for example, somebody else sit on the computer and try to log in also on your side, they will resume the authentication flow from the previous user. So it wasn't perfect in the beginning. Then it evolved into storing the pipeline state on the database, and a token was generated. You can use that token to send it in an email or store the link somehow, or share the link to the user on one way or another, and that unique token will identify your authentication process, and the session was not involved anymore. So you could continue, you could start your authentication process on your work computer, then go to your home and continue the process on your home computer.
In terms of the different protocols and implementations of those protocols for different authentication providers, they'll all have a different set of attributes that they're able to support or that they'll provide. And so I'm wondering how you approach that challenge in terms of determining what the minimum set of common parameters are and how to take advantage of the additional attributes and merge that all into a cohesive user profile on the end of the site that's implementing Python Social Auth.
Yeah, so Python still tries to solve the bare minimum of the problem. So it focuses on a really small set of attributes in order to work, like email or username or first and last name. With those really small attributes, it's able to build a user and store that in the database. These are very based, basically based on Django user model that it was based from Django Social Auth. It was inherited from there. Still, you are able to define what actually attributes you want to pull from the different authentication providers. Some of them can be pulled automatically by the library because the APIs it used by default is able to provide these attributes. Sometimes, or most of the cases, you need to actually extend the pipeline in order to retrieve the extra attributes you want to store on your project. Like you want to download the profile picture from Google, then you need to add a method to that pipeline to do that particular API request. And that's where Python CLOud is out of the of what it offers. You can extend, you can pull anything you want, but you need that implementation yourself.
And so it's probably worth digging a bit more into the user's perspective of implementing Python Social Auth and the overall workflow there, and maybe dig into the pipeline mechanism that you have for being able to handle these different stages of authentication and how you manage the attributes and permissions from the identity providers that you're getting.
Yeah, so from developer perspective, usually all you need to do is go to the authentication provider administration panel or page. There's usually one dedicated for developers where you can create an application. Once you create that application with certain values like a redirect URL, you will get an application ID, application secret, or an application ID for OpenID. There's bare minimum settings that then you go to your project, add these particular keys in your settings to be available for the backend that will handle the authentication. Then you can include a URL or a button on a template And once the user clicks on this button, the authentication flow kicks in, and you end with a created user or an existing user already logging on your site. So it tries to be really simple. There's the complexity of going to the panel to create this application and certain requirements from these providers. But then on the Python CLI side, it's a set of settings, a URL, a link, that's all. But if you want to extend the functionality, like in the previous example, download the profile picture, the work is a little more involved. You need to figure out which are the permissions name or scope name you need to use to be able to access this profile picture from Google, for example. Add that scope to a setting, and with the scope there, you will get granted access to the API that provides the picture, and then you can call this API to download the file and store it in your local storage or where it needs to be. So the really simple solution. It usually is enough for everybody or for most of the projects. If you want more involved solution, you can do that. There's room for that, and that was a goal of the project too.
And another concept that's often conflated with authentication is that of authorization. And I'm wondering how you handle that aspect of the overall process of identification and permissioning in Python Social Auth, or if that's something that you leave entirely to the developers as a separate concern from what you're trying to tackle in this library.
Yeah, Python sellout actually doesn't care about that at all. I understand there's an abuse of authorization protocols of OAuth, and they are, even if they are only to authorize access to API, they can also be used to create a user on your site and authenticate the user in your site. So there's a fine line there that you could usually cross. OAuth is used for authentication as well. In the end, it's up to the developer to decide if you want to use OAuth for authentication or just authorization to access APIs on behalf of the user. My experience is that OAuth is the most common protocol around the web, and it's usually used for authentication as well as authorization.
Yeah, and in terms of the scope of the application that is granting these identities to the users, authorization also takes on a different scope of what they're allowed to do within the application, which is not something that you necessarily want to rely on third-party identity providers and their scopes of determining, and something that you would have to build as a primary concern for your own application. And I know that there are a number of other libraries available for Django and other frameworks for handling that concern, which is definitely a separate and differently complex beast to tackle. And then in terms of the protocols that you support, as you said, a number of these identity providers are using now OAuth 2, but also some of them are using OAuth 1. And then there are things like OpenID and SAML, and they all have different variations of how they handle the overall flow. And I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process of building support for all of these different authentication protocols into this library.
So I was lucky enough to be able to build Python Sellout on the shoulders of other bigger projects like OpenID, Python OpenID, or OAuth Lib. There's also a SAML library that will integrate with will provide you the access to the protocol on a simple way. So it wasn't that difficult to integrate the different protocols. All as since Python Social Out actually cares about the bare minimum solution to the problem, it actually requires very little from this library. Usually a URL that the user is going to be sent to grant permissions, input the credentials, grant permissions, etc. And then there's a secondary API that gets called most of the time. It gets called to get some extra details. OpenID has the difference that these user details are already provided in the response back to your site. But this complexity is all hidden on these libraries I use, or this little small complexity that I need to implement on Python Sellout in order to access the needed attributes. So in the end, the authentication flow is similar on the different protocols. You send the user to a site, the site sends the user back to you, you exchange a few attributes from an API, and that's all. Yeah, and that's all the Python CLI actually cares about.
And as somebody who has been working in the space of federated identity for so long, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the current state of affairs in terms of the available protocols, and if you think that there are any missing elements or if there's space for a new protocol to be defined that will improve upon the existing set that we have, or any shortcomings in the protocols that you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
I don't have strong opinions about different protocols. I know they're there to solve different problems. I really would like to see a unified protocol that removes the gaps between OpenID and OAuth, for example, which are the most common protocols around the web of today. Having a single solution that provides both, like OAuth is used today, is actually abused today to do authentication, something similar that merge OpenID, OAuth could be a nice solution to see around. So from a developer perspective today, they actually have the option to avoid the hassle of integrating social authentication on their site, or the many sites, or the different protocols. Even with Python CLI that try to solve the differences, there are appearing simpler solutions today. Services that will provide you social authentication or user authentication as a service. It reduces actually the work you need to do. So in the end, for developers, which is the word I care, with this library, is becoming even simpler to add this feature to your site.
And in terms of your experience of using Python Social Auth, or your conversations with people who have been using it for their own purposes, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or innovative ways that you've seen it used?
So I don't usually get feedback or innovative ways that the library is being used. I usually land on a blog post here or there, or something pop-ups on my Twitter feed. But there was a particular project that probably wins the contest of being innovative, and it was a user using Python social auth to authenticate, and once authenticated, the garage door of the house opened or closed. I don't remember the details now, but I don't remember if you log in and you have the control of the garage door on this website, or automatically by logging in, your garage door will open or close, depending on the state. It was a really fun read. I can find the blog post anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting way to abuse the pipeline where you
Yeah.
can run arbitrary functions just as a result of different stages completing. So
Yeah, indeed.
And then in terms of your experience of building and growing the community around it, I'm wondering how that has evolved, and just some of the overall benefits and learning experiences that you've had as a result of it gaining popularity, and then splitting it into its own GitHub organization and onboarding new committers and maintainers to the project.
Yes, so sadly there are no more maintainers on the project. I tried to add a couple years ago, and the experience actually didn't work out. It's not that they were bad maintainers or anything, but in the end, the amount of work added to the project actually they abandoned the effort, so that I discarded that option since then, sadly, because I really would like to delegate a lot of the work that is needed for the library. I'm at a point of my life where dedicating time to Python sellout is really something I'm struggling with. New maintainers would be really welcome to the project to revive the efforts and the different development that is needed at the moment. I have a big list of different items I want to work on the area, but I need to find the time to dedicate to it. And right now I'm currently on a low maintenance mode where I go in, review the different pull requests, request some changes, and merge a few here and there, and then release a new version of the library with the last pull request merged.
And in terms of the primary focus, it definitely seems like, particularly given its origin of being integrated with Django, that it's primarily used in web contexts, but is it viable to use in other types of environments where it's primarily just for authenticating between backends, or maybe in terms of some sort of industrial automation or Internet of Things contexts, or is it primarily just focused on a web environment, and anything that people might choose to use it for outside of that context, they're sort of treading their own path?
So up to date, it remains a web-only solution. There's still my plans improving that area with the introduction of strategies on Python Social Auth that opens the door to implement new ways of integrating the library on new places. I really would like a solution that's fully console integration, that you can, the usually token number is based on the console or stuff like that, or a UI. It doesn't need to be a web one. That's one of the strategy I would like to work at some point. But yeah, the door is open to integrate it with more environments, not just web.
And what other plans do you have for the future of the project, either in terms of the technical aspects or community aspects, or just your overall ambitions of where you might take it, or additional projects that you might build within its ecosystem?
So for community, I don't have any particular plans. It has its own flow as it is right now. I get pull requests from time to time, and that's good enough, in my opinion. Technical aspect, yeah, I have quite a list, like Python 2 removal, Python 2 support removal, async and await support, and integration with newer micro frameworks like Fast API or Sonic. Implement a pure WCGI or HSGI strategies that they actually don't depend on any framework, non-web integrations, and improvements here and there. SQL Alchemy integration, it needs some love. I know better the library now. I know I can do a better code there. And of course, documentation. The documentation needs a lot of work in improve examples, improve documentation on how to implement new strategies, new backends, new integration, etc. There's a lot to do.
And are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing with Python Social Auth and the library, or any of the associated topics with identification and authorization and authentication that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
No, actually, no. I actually like Python Social Auth. It is trying to solve the bare minimum to the problem. I really like to keep it that way.
Okay. Well, for anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing, or get in touch or offer contributions, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the Joker movie, which came out recently. I think they did a very good job of portraying the character and giving a believable and meaningful origin story, and a lot of really good acting throughout. So for anybody who is at all interested in that overall story space of the Batman mythos and the DC characters, it's definitely worth a look. Not your typical Superman story, definitely much more character driven, but worth a watch. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Matthias. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, I have a technical one that I'm really enjoying using this new micro framework, Sonic, which focus on async and await support on Python 3. I really having some fun. It's close to Flask on API, but it has its own small things that make very comfortable to work on. Non-technical picks. I'm really looking forward to watch the new Star Trek Picard series. I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm really fan of the saga, and this one is really promising.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss your experiences of building the Python Social Auth framework. It's a tool that I've used pretty extensively in the projects that we do at work, and it's made our lives a lot simpler. So thank you for all of your efforts on that front, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me over.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.